Good evening. Peace be with you all. Thank you so much for joining us for today's panel discussion titled Visualising Return, which is the fourth event hosted by the Palestinian Return Centre, that's as part of their second annual Return Week. It basically seeks to mobilise Palestinians across the world and our allies to stand up for, to call for, and to reaffirm. To stand up, to call for, and to reaffirm the right of return. I'm your host, Batool Subeiti, and I'm super excited with the very solid panel discussion that we have today with Richard, Mona, and Salem. Before I introduce our speakers, though, I very quickly and briefly want to speak about and introduce the significance and the importance of the right to return. The right to return signifies the correction of the course of justice, not just for Palestinians, but for the whole world. Because if the right to return is not realized, then that is tantamount to legitimizing the rape and the occupation of a people's land. And its violent process through theft, annexation, murder, and oppression of the worst kind. Therefore, on a primary level, the right to return isn't simply about granting Palestinian rights, but the right of humanity to not transgress the boundaries of human rights. In the case there is no right to return, then the biggest shame to have occurred in humanity, that is the theft of Palestine, would basically remain in the conscience of the world. If there is no right to return, then human values will be stripped to nothing, because the narrow interests of the superpowers to create a state at the detriment of another people has occurred at the expense of human values. And when values are reduced to nothing, and is occurring at the principles of expense and values, and there is no accountability, then that is the recipe for arrogant powers to repeat the aggression and to get away with it. The shame that is occurring in Palestine needs to be reversed, and the first step towards this is actually guaranteeing the right of return. And without this reverse and granting the right of return, then the whole of humanity will suffer. Now, before introducing our speakers, if you do have any questions that you would like to address to our speakers, then we'll give that opportunity towards the end via a Q&A. So just to introduce our first speaker, we have Salem Nusseibeh. So he is currently the president for the UCL Students for Justice for Palestine, and he's an avid supporter of Palestinian human rights, and Students for Justice for Palestine has been doing amazing work on the ground, very unapologetic across universities despite all the censorship that they're facing. So thank you very much.
No, we're still in. Is it on? Oh, there.
Hopefully you can all hear me.
No, it's not. It's not.
It's not.
TD Richard.
Oh, sorry.
Hopefully this is working now. It is a great pleasure of mine and honour to be sitting on a panel with such distinguished guests and in such an important gathering today. There will be much probably spoken on the right of return by our distinguished guests and by the panelists, but I want to shed a light on it as a Palestinian. As a Palestinian student, we must first agree upon the principles. And the foundational principle is that there must be an unconditional affirmation of the right to return for every Palestinian outside of Palestine from the river to the sea. There are no ifs, there are no buts. The right of every Palestinian. Here we do not speak only about those victims of overt ethnic cleansing, the victims of the Nakba, those Palestinians who live in squalor in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, in Egypt, reduced at best perhaps to second-class citizens. But the right to return for all those Palestinians who in reality were subject to sometimes perhaps more covert methods of ethnic cleansing. The creation of socio-economic conditions so oppressive, so draconian, that Palestinians fled across the globe, to Europe, to North America, to the Gulf states, seeking a better life. All of them have a right to return. I want to emphasize that what we are speaking about here is not a utopian ideal. If it were, then there would be no Israeli law of return. According to them, the disparate peoples of the Jewish people have a right to return after thousands of years from all across the globe. They see that as realistic enough to be implemented in law. And how many thousands have come to Palestine and settled? So if that is realistic, then what of the vast majority of exiled Palestinians who live in neighboring countries? Jordan, as I mentioned, Syria, Lebanon. It is not impossible for these people to return. It is very much realistic. I also want to warn you about the notion of realism. Because when we talk about Palestine, lo and behold, many people become skeptics and cynics. Conveniently so, perhaps. But in reality, it is not idealistic. It is about the will. This is a matter of will. Where there is will, one can change the reality that one is subjugated to. You know, realism, which has shaped Western, or supposedly shaped Western foreign policy for the last few decades, embodied in the likes of Kissinger, it's not really realism, is it? Kissinger was not following a policy of realism. He was following a policy of American idealism. What's that idealism? To subjugate, to exploit, to oppress, to tyrannize, all to achieve America's aims across the globe. That is the American ideal. But they veiled it in a nice package called realism, so that we'd be fooled. Unbeknownst to us, we'd be saying we can't do this or that. We can't secure our basic human rights. Human rights enshrined in UN Resolution 194 and reaffirmed in another resolution as an inalienable right. So when we talk about the right of return, we don't talk about something idealistic. And I don't really like the term right to return. It's an obligation to return. It's a duty to return. Palestinians must return. Because to what end has our exodus taken place? Our exile, our fleeing the battlefield, being locked up, our land being taken from us. We just saw recently the news about Gaza. Officially now, I mean, they don't even hide it, the world's largest prison, a wall encircling it. To what end? I'll tell you very clearly there. The end is that the Palestinians remain a subjugated minority. A subjugated minority which Israel can do with as they please. This is the aim. This is why ethnic cleansing took place. And this is why I mentioned as well, or it's perhaps something that one can learn from the difference between the law of return and the right of return. The very law upon which Israelis being able to settle in Palestine is predicated on is a law based in race. It's the idea that Israel is an ethno-state. It is a state based around ethnic and racial superiority. it's an ethno-state that we must resist. And the policies that they have implemented seek to ensure that the Palestinians are always a minority. And this is at the heart of our message here today, or at least my message here today, which is the idea that the Palestinians must return to their homelands, must rebuild their homelands. They must go back and change that power relationship. It cannot be any longer a majority subjugating a minority. As students, and as a few of us here, and as generally activists for the Palestinian cause, we must understand that we have particular obligations upon us. Amongst them is to raise awareness and education. It might sound cliché, but when you consider 5 million Palestinians roughly live outside of historic Palestine, when you consider the conditions to which many of them are subjugated, when you remember that many of them, many decades have passed, their homes have been taken, 600 villages destroyed in 1948 alone after the Nakba, or during the Nakba, then you remember the importance of educating, that we never forget. Because so long as we do not forget, there will always be a standard by which we can hold the international community and the global community. And even if the global community and the international community seeks to cast a doubt in our right, in our inalienable right to return, we do not hold too much value to them. Yes, their own United Nations General Assembly resolutions testify to that right. But it's not about whether they are with us or whether they're against us. This is about something that was alluded to, a human right. And it's quite fitting that we have on our panel someone who is from Ireland. Because this is not the story of the Palestinians alone. This is the story of the whole peoples of the oppressed world, what was known as the Third World, and elsewhere, the colonized world. That it would not be inappropriate to now draw parallels, for instance, with what happened in North America, or indeed South America. To know that the plan of the colonialist is to get rid of any opposition, settler colonialism, to change the ethnic makeup, to get rid of the native. The second point is, as I said, to understand that this is not idealism. That is to understand that we are at the vanguard, or indeed we may be the vanguard for this change which needs to take place. Those of us, those here with us today, or those watching, or people who have a conscience all around the world, they are at the vanguard of change, both within Palestine and outside Palestine. We saw this in the protests, 200,000 people or so attended here in London a few months ago. Within Palestine, we saw uprisings from within the Zionist entity. Unprecedented. And just yesterday or recently, we were celebrating 34 years since the First Intifada. Inspiration to us all, to remember our role in being that vanguard for change, not believing it is impossible. And third, in keeping in mind ethnic cleansing and colonial projects, reaffirming and reasserting, as I mentioned, the obligation to return. I really want to leave that message with you today. Exhibitions like this, events like this, discussions like this are the first step to recognize what is going on, what so many people are duped by, and then to make that change. When people recognize the injustice, that it is unacceptable on every account, then rest assured, justice will come after that, inshallah. Because then it becomes a matter of planning and organization and tactics, and all that in reality is easy. That's where the politics, the interpolitics comes in, and people squabble and people debate. But the principle, that is where the real change comes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. for that very, very powerful exposition of actually reminding us about the importance of our personal responsibility and duty towards this very holy cause, and the idea that actually oppression itself is not sustainable, so it will not last. And when you have that will, to return, that's evidence in itself that Palestine will be free. And thank you also for alluding back to the root cause of the issue and centralizing it on how it's actually the colonizers. It's America, right, that has taken over the role of Britain, that is the reason that we're in the situation that we are today. Because of course we know that the Zionists are playthings at the hands of the imperialists, and the Zionist project was a way for the imperialists to actually actualize their vision in West Asia. I think even Joe Biden himself once said that if there were no Zionists, we would have invented an Israel, to achieve our goals. So it's not just about them per se, it's the very fact that they will use anything in that way to pursue their objectives. Thank you for that, Sunny. Up next we have Richard. Super excited to introduce you. Richard Barrett is an Irish People Before Profit Solidarity TD. Since the 2011 general election, Boyd-Barrett helped to organise mass protests against the war in Iraq in 2003 as chair for the Irish anti-war movement. He has continuously politically fought for Ireland's Israeli ambassador to be expelled and to place sanctions on Israel for its brutal treatment of Palestinians and its apartheid regime. Thank you so much, Richard, for coming all the way from Dublin to be with us. So please.
Thank you very much, Batool, and thank you very much to the Palestinian Rights Centre for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm delighted to listen to Salem and soon to Mona, who I was informing her she has an Irish name. She didn't realise, which we just discovered means little noble one in Gaelic. So I think she's quite pleased with that. Look, the first thing I want to say, and I feel a particular need to say it, given the way in which those of us who speak up for Palestine in Britain, particularly Britain in recent years, have been treated and demonised. I feel the need to say, right at the outset, that Israel is a racist, apartheid state that owes its existence to the brutal ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people and maintains its existence through a cruel system of apartheid and racism and ongoing ethnic cleansing of an entirely innocent people. And that to say that is to suggest that to make that statement, that a state of that sort does not have a right to exist, is somehow a statement of anti-Semitism, is the greatest example of victim blaming I could ever imagine. And yet, it seems acceptable in Britain and in many parts of the world now to suggest that if you make that statement, you are somehow anti-Semitic and guilty of some crime of racism against the Jewish people, when the absolute opposite is the truth. And I would like really to say to people here or anywhere who suggest that to question the right of the Israeli apartheid state to exist, that it is somehow anti-Semitic, I would like to put that back on them and say quite the contrary. If you have any respect for the memory of the Holocaust and the terrible crime that was done to the Jewish people as a result of a horrendous racist ideology promulgated by the Nazis, if you have any respect for that memory, and if you have any determination to ensure that sort of horror should never be repeated again against anybody, against any race, then you are duty-bound to speak up for the Palestinian people and to challenge the right of the apartheid state in Israel to exist. And at the center of that assertion is the question of, this is making a lot of noise, isn't it? At the center of that assertion is the question of the right to return. Both in terms of the reality of the Palestinians who were driven out by Zionist terror gangs in 1948. Stop, I was cracking too much. Sorry. That were driven out in a horrendous act of ethnic cleansing, deliberate act of ethnic cleansing, using the most ruthless, vicious, murderous tactics in 1947 and 48, the Nakba, where 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, and then successive waves of ethnic cleansing since then by Israel against the Palestinian people and the establishment of a state that is racist to its core. That is not just racist or apartheid as a result of the policies of this or that government, but that if you look at the issue of return, what you discover is the racism is endemic. It is part and parcel of what the state of Israel is. And it is embodied and encapsulated in the issue of return. Because at the heart of the Israeli state is the Israeli law of return, which confers rights on Jewish people from anywhere in the world at any time who may have no connection whatsoever to the land of Palestine or Israel or whatever you want to call it, but who have no connection whatsoever, who can claim the right of citizenship and nationality in that land, but that same right is denied to now 7.5 million Palestinians scattered all around the world or living in refugee camps as exiles, as Salem said, in Lebanon, in the most horrendous conditions, absolutely shocking and unbelievable conditions, or in Syria, or in Jordan, or scattered across the world as a diaspora. Denied the right ever to return and claim the right of citizenship or nationality in the place where they owe their origins. That is at the heart of the Israeli or Zionist project, is that denial of a fundamental right to a people who have been the subject of crime against humanity, which is what ethnic cleansing is and what apartheid is. And that is ongoing and systematic. And there can only be, the only just solution for anybody who believes at any level in human rights, human decency, in international law, in democracy, or who claims to stand against racism, or who claims to respect the memory of the Holocaust and the terrible things that were done to Jewish people. The only thing such a person can say is that that state must be dismantled, just as the apartheid state was dismantled. And that to say that is not anti-Semitic, it is the absolute opposite. It is about vindicating human rights and decency and justice and self-determination and freedom and everything that any decent person should want to fight for and believe in. And this is something that is not so hard to say in Ireland, as sadly it has become in Britain and elsewhere, if you say these things, because this is a history with which we are very familiar. And the overlaps between the history of the Palestinian people and the suffering and persecution that they have had visited on them and that they continue to suffer is a story that remarkably parallels our own history. And indeed it is not an exaggeration to say that in many ways the model of oppression and persecution and apartheid that has been and is being inflicted on the Palestinians is a model that was developed in Ireland. But I will say, on a hopeful note, that even though we had a regime very, very similar imposed on us by Britain for hundreds of years, 700 to 800 years, we have not fully succeeded yet, but we have gone a considerable way to uprooting that regime of oppression and dismantling the regime of apartheid that was imposed on Ireland. And really the parallels are quite remarkable. I don't want to sort of give you a huge detailed history. But the system of colonization, of settler colonization, that is at the heart of the Israeli project, where an empire uses a settler people to colonize and create a division in a country that they wish to rule, or in an area that they wish to rule. And that was at the heart of the British project in trying to subjugate and control Ireland, was a policy of divide and rule using a settler population that was planted in Ireland, first under the Cromwellian period and later in the Williamite period. The particular weapon of division that was used then was Catholic and Protestant. All human beings, of course, but where religious division is used as a weapon to divide and rule the Irish population. And then a set of laws, known as the penal laws, which systematically then discriminate against the Catholic population in favour of the Protestant population, in order to inject into the Protestant minority population the idea that they are superior to the Catholic population, and that therefore the subjugation of the Catholic population is justified. To dehumanize the Catholic population as somehow lesser human beings, and therefore to justify the colonial subjugation of that people. And in fact, there's a fantastic description by Edmund Burke, who was he was a British MP, but actually he was from Ireland originally. But he described the penal laws, which were laws very like the apartheid laws that are inflicted on the people of Palestine today, that systematic, ongoing discrimination at every level. And he described them as if I can read my own writing, a machine of wise and elaborate contrivance, as well fitted for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people, and the debasement in them of human nature itself, as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man. A brilliant description, but a description could every bit equally apply to the system of apartheid that is imposed on the Palestinian people. And it is, the parallels become even more remarkable when you consider the Irish Revolution that occurs begins, there are successive waves of resistance by the Irish, again and again and again, resisting British rule, trying to overcome those sectarian divisions that Britain had entrenched in the colonial regime. But when the Irish Revolution begins in 1916, and then explodes in the period 1918 to 1921, eventually leading to at least driving Britain out of most of the country, but critically resulting also in the partition of Ireland between the Republic in the south and the north, where there was a predominantly Protestant population who remained loyal to the empire. But the Governor General of Jerusalem in 1936, a man called Ronald Storrs, who was the first Governor General of Jerusalem since Pontius Pilate, appropriately enough, when he described what the British project was, this is just 10 years before the Nakba, when he described what the British project in Palestine was, he said that the Balfour Declaration and British support for the Zionist movement was with the intention of, quote, creating a loyal little Jewish Ulster amid a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. Ulster was the northern part of Ireland that was partitioned and where the settler Protestant community who remained loyal to Britain were concentrated. So in the very, very same way that sectarian division, racist division, between Catholics and Protestants formed the basis of how Britain sought to subjugate Ireland and to prevent the Irish Revolution from being fully successful. At the heart of it was this divide and rule tactic. And precisely that tactic, and indeed many of the same individuals who had developed those tactics and those strategies in Ireland, would then move directly from Ireland to Palestine after causing havoc. So Balfour had gained fame in Ireland in 1887 for opening fire on demonstrations by small farmers fighting for control back of their land, to take back their land from the British landlords who controlled it. The notorious Black and Tans and auxiliaries were these vicious troops, many of them convicts, murderers, that were sent into Ireland to try and crush the revolution between 1918 and 1921. Where were they sent? Immediately after they finished doing their dirty work in Ireland, they were sent to Palestine to try and suppress protests, strikes, and demonstrations that were happening in Palestine. So we are very familiar with these tactics. And I say to anybody who condemns the resistance of the Palestinian people against those sort of tactics of divide and rule, of racism, and so on, that for you to deny the right of Palestinian people to challenge a regime like that is as obnoxious and as ridiculous as it would now be to claim that the Irish had no right to resist the regime of colonial oppression that existed in Ireland. And of course, it's not so long ago that people in Britain did. The establishment in Britain did deny that right and sought to demonise people who resisted that regime. But there's very few now who would say that there was something sectarian or wrong about the Irish people seeking to end British rule in Ireland. And it's funny how in my lifetime even that has changed. And it should be a matter of hope for those who are fighting and supporting the Palestinian cause to consider that. When I was a teenager coming to London, the Irish were distrusted, we were subject to racist stereotypes, we faced regular harassments, we faced many of the sort of the casual racism that Muslim people face today. But that has changed a lot. Because, of course, it wasn't the Irish who were to blame. We weren't the problem in resisting, it was Britain who were the problem in maintaining an obnoxious sectarian regime and a completely unjustifiable colonial subjugation of a people that they were trying to rob their resources and control their country. And so I really ask people, I know I don't have to convince people here, but I think we have to convince people in Britain and elsewhere that to somehow deny the right of Palestinian people to challenge a regime as obnoxious as the Israeli regime is as ridiculous as to suggest that the Irish people had no right to oppose the sectarian regime that they had imposed in Ireland and that which Ireland has largely, although not fully, liberated itself. And the last point I just want to make is the importance of art in all of that, and why I'm particularly pleased to be at an art exhibition about the right to return. Because absolutely central to the successful Irish Revolution was imagining the liberation in literature, in music, in culture, and in art, just as is being done with these wonderful pieces of art around here. But political resistance is not just about the demonstrations, about the placards, about the political debates, about taking up arms, although it can be and is, about all of those things at various points in time, but also critical to the Irish Revolution was the imaginative reclaiming of Ireland through literature and music and art. Literally retaking Ireland and remapping Ireland through the imagination. And one of the people who best understood this was a fantastic Palestinian intellectual. If for anybody who hasn't read him, I really would encourage them to do so, was Edward Said. And he wrote a brilliant piece. He was collaborating with Irish intellectuals and writers and artists in a project called the Field Day Project, where he wrote an absolutely brilliant pamphlet about W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, who was one of the chief figures in what was called the Celtic Revival, the Irish literary revival that, if you like, presaged the revolutionary movement that was to drive Britain out of the 26 counties, at least, during that period between 1916 and 1921, and of which people like James Joyce were a part. Their politics were quite different, it's important to say, but all of them were doing a similar thing, even from slightly different perspectives, and there's always different political perspectives. When you're involved in a project of decolonisation, there's going to be debates. There was people with religious ideas, there was people with secular ideas, there was people with right-wing ideas, there was people with left-wing ideas, but what all of them were engaged in was in retaking Ireland through the imagination, and that presaged the actual political movement of liberation. And that's what I think an exhibition like this is doing, and why it's such an important part of the project of liberation for Palestine, and why I'm so delighted to be here. And I want to finish on that note with a poem from W.B. Yeats that was written in 1919, just after the horror of World War I, a war where 14 million people were massacred across the world by the very imperial powers that were sponsoring colonialism in Ireland, that were sponsoring colonialism in Palestine, and W.B. Yeats, whose politics sometimes were problematic, to put it mildly, but who nonetheless sensed in this terrible upheaval and sometimes in the horror that was witnessed at that time, that some new forces were rising that were going to change things, transform the world and challenge the world that had produced that horror of war and colonialism. And I'm just going to finish by reading that because I think it's kind of appropriate when we're discussing art or looking at art. So the poem is called The Second Coming, and it has a particular Palestinian reference at the end, which I particularly like. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming? Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Thank you, Richard, for that very powerful exposition, specifically how you raise the parallel contrasts that you see, because obviously the perpetrator is the same, hence their tactics are obviously going to be very similar. And it's always important to center back the Palestinian struggle for justice as the world superpowers conspired to uproot the Palestinian people. Let's never forget that. Like, it wasn't just the case that Britain handed over this project to the UN, but you had the US that was the first entity to actually recognize the legitimacy of what was then called Israel, right? As this project. And you had the USSR that followed suit as well. So you had the whole world superpowers coming to conspire to uproot the Palestinians. That in itself shows you the magnitude of the oppression. Also, thank you very much for, as a politician, I highly respect the fact that you're coming out here and you're exposing the witch hunt of anti-Semitism for what it really is. That's being used as a political tool. The suffering of a people is being used as a political tool to stifle any kind of criticism or debate onto the perpetrators of aggression. This is something that unfortunately many politicians hesitate to speak about. We know obviously Jeremy Corbyn was thrown right under the bus. He went from being second to becoming Prime Minister to then relegated to being thrown out of his party. That's how bad the witch hunt against anti-Semitism was. We had others like Chris Williamson and Jackie Walker who were completely just thrown out of the party simply for just advocating for Palestinian rights. So thank you very much. It's a very, very honourable position to take, despite the price that is paid in the process. Up next we have, finally, Shtaya. Mona is a Palestinian digital rights defender. She's working as an advocacy advisor at Hamla, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. She is also a partner scholar for both Sa'id Foundation and Chapman Awards Scholarship 2021-2022, and is studying an MA in Social Media and Digital Communications at the University of Westminster. Mona had worked previously with several civil society organizations. She was the Community Outreach Coordinator of Transparency Palestine, the National Chapter of Transparency International. Please give a huge round of applause for Mona.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having us here today. I don't think I will start from the right return, as the both great guests were talking like greatly about that. But I'll start talking about what should we do as a young Palestinians till we return from now. As a digital rights defender, I see that the situation in Palestine is much more complicated than any other part of the world who previously had a settler colonialism, because we Palestinians are really fragmented all over around the world. Even Palestinians inside Palestine, we are not sitting together around one table to talk together about our struggle or about our common problems, because we have different kind of problems. We have the political split between West Bank and Gaza Strip, but also we have the settler colonialism that is imposed on us, on Palestinians, and it's also impacted Palestinian citizens of Israel. And because of that, today we have to sit together and we have to utilize social media, which is my background as a digital rights defender. We have to open or to use the social media platforms as a networking tool to speak together, just to know what Palestinians around the world are suffering. Because Palestinians in Lebanon are suffering from different problems than Palestinians in the West Bank, totally different from what Palestinians in Gaza Strip, and I believe it's also totally different from Palestinian citizens of Israel and other Palestinians around the world. But the fact that we are living in that fragmentation, we sometimes are forgetting that our brothers and sisters, Palestinian brothers and sisters, are having different problems because they are living in a different places around the world, and they have different implications and they have other situations that they are living. Because of that, sometimes we are forgetting, let's say, the collective memory, the collective visualizing for the return, and just focusing on our daily life without thinking about the long term and the right to return. And because of that, today is the day where we can start thinking together to visualize our return, to speak together, to understand what we want, what is the future of Palestine and future of Palestinian people? What kind of return we want as Palestinian? I believe the young generation, the Palestinian young generation, who have never ever elected our people, our representatives, unfortunately, and even our ELO, which is the only representative for the Palestinian people, which have never ever have elections for that, we at least should think about that. Should think what kind of ELO do we want, and do we have actually now? What kind of future do we want as Palestinian? The majority of Palestinians are young Palestinians, but who is taking decisions on our behalf? Most of them are people over 70, while over 70% of us are under 30. So that's shameful. We should think together what future we want for Palestine. So we can visualize our return, so we can think about our return, so we can at least think what kind of Palestine we want. We don't want to go back again to political split or to some kind of split based on religious or on ethnicity or in any other discriminatory basis that our brothers and sisters in the Arab world are having because of their regimes, oppressive regimes. We want a free Palestine. We want everyone who's living between the river and the sea to live in equality, justice, and freedom. And because of that, today we should start debating. Today we should start discussing with each other what kind of Palestine, what are our common principles. Let's forget our differences because we might disagree on specific things, but we have a main thing, which is liberating Palestine, and because of that, we should today start talking about that. Having said that, I can't ignore what kind of digital oppression we as Palestinians are facing on a daily basis. May is not far away from now, where most of the Palestinian content on the social media platforms was taken down or was shadow banned from the social media platforms. That's not a recent phenomenon that we are seeing. That started decades ago when the Israeli government have established the Israeli Cyber Unit in 2015 in order to monitor and to document the Palestinian content on the social media platforms, where they are reporting massively to the social media companies to take down the Palestinian content. And that's disastrous. We are forcibly displaced from our homes on the ground, but we are also oppressed on the digital space. So no Palestinian can share the human rights violations that we are exposed to on the ground. We have observed that during May, but we also we're documenting that from the previous years. Just think with me, I'm thinking loudly with you. In 2016, the Israeli Cyber Unit have reported over 2,242 cases, requests to the social media companies. Having request does not mean one piece of content. Request is a message which can include hundreds of pieces of content. So that was developing till the past year, where they have over 20,000 requests to social media companies. And I believe this year is way higher than the previous year with all the political escalations that happened on the ground. So we can't also talk about communication online, ignoring all the surveillance that is imposed against Palestinian activists and human rights defenders, which I believe you've heard and you read about what happened over the past couple of months with the Palestinian human rights defenders, Palestinian human rights organizations who were designated as a terrorist organizations by the Israeli government, and they were spying on their employees using the Pegasus spyware, which is related to the NSO. We can't speak about surveillance and mass surveillance without thinking about the intersectionality, which Richard had started. Israel is now profiting from the occupation. They have developed themselves. They are not only occupiers, they are also exporting this kind of surveillance. They are exporting oppression worldwide, specifically to the Arab regime and also to other oppressive global South regimes, where they are using these surveillance technologies to oppress their people, to silence them, and prevent them from criticizing their regime. So this is like a whole chain of, or an infinite chain of discrimination and settler colonialism thinking that they are exporting around the world. Having said that, we can't think about liberating Palestine or about return without thinking how we could and we should connect with other people's struggle around the world. We can't think about return without thinking how people, like in May, while the attack was on Palestinian digital rights and Palestinian content, our comrades on Colombia, the indigenous people there, who were protesting and taking the streets, also they were facing same kind of digital oppression from the social media companies. And when we coordinate together, when we have such coordinated actions, Instagram have sent or have published a statement where they apologize for Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, as well as the indigenous people of Colombia. And that's like a very recent and a very clear case where we should coordinate our struggle alongside other people, other oppressed people in the region, but also in the global south, so we can think together what kind of return, but also what kind of freedom that we are seeking. That's very important, visualizing that. Today we are sitting in art exhibition. All these beautiful artworks and pictures, if they were on the social media platforms, they might be taken down. But there was one very important thing that happened during May, which helped and shift the Palestinian narrative on the social media platforms, which was how our allies around the world were amplifying Palestinian voices, amplifying Palestinian content. They were sharing, retweeting, and echoing our voices in their communities. They believe in this human rights cause where they should support Palestinians. I believe we should build on that. We don't want the Palestinian cause to be a trendy cause where it's up only in May and now no one is talking about that. We should keep the momentum. We should keep mobilizing and organizing Palestinians between ourselves, but also with our allies and other progressive movements around the world, specifically with the oppressed people, because we feel them and they feel us. Having said that, we should start from now as Palestinian young people and as a progressive young people around the world, thinking together what kind of return we want in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mana, again, for that very powerful exposition, specifically centering it back to the importance of unity around the Palestinian struggle, how we need to put all our differences on the side and unite on the fact that Palestine needs to be liberated by any means necessary, and actually searching for what is the best way to liberate Palestine. And of course, armed struggle and armed resistance is at the very heart of that. Also, when you mentioned Facebook and other social medias with their censorship, I mean, it's no surprise you have swathes of members of the IDF, or rather the IOF, who actually work for Facebook and work for these kinds of platforms. So that kind of collaboration and that collusion, of course, is only a necessary product and a direct product of that. Okay, we have around a few minutes, I should say. I'm happy to extend the time a little bit more because, of course, questions and answers are very important. Does anyone have any questions? And I'll allow the mic to go around. Just put your hands up if you do. Okay, then I think I shall start by asking. Sure. Yeah, I want to prioritize the audience as much as possible, but yeah, please put your hands up.
Hi, my name is Rina. it's a question, but it's also kind of a comment from devil's advocate. So I'm all for social media and using social media platforms to talk about Palestinian rights and violations in Palestine. And I was here in May when things were happening in Palestine, and then I was in Palestine a week later when things escalated. And while I think it's very useful to use these platforms to inform, I'm not sure who we're targeting or who we're talking to. I think we all have our own circles, whether it's a circle of 6 people or 600 people. And most of the time, you are exposed to people who are very similar to you in kind of ideology and beliefs. And having lived in 3 countries over the last 10 years, I must say that 90% of my social contacts have more or less similar views on Palestine. And I've decided that I'm not going to engage in any of the social media platforms talking about Palestine. So that's kind of me thinking, what can we actually do with that? And my second question is to the rest of the panel. As Palestinians living in the UK, what can we actually do to support Palestinian rights in Palestine? That's it.
I think it's up to you.
I have some of the others that answer the questions first. I mean, Mona is the expert on social media, so
Second question.
I do think you have a serious point. That's why I'm hoping Mona, as the expert, will have an answer to that. But there is a problem with just talking to the bubble. There is a problem, and I think the left generally, not just the Palestinian cause, I think people who are fighting for progressive change around the world need to have a realistic assessment. I personally think it can be an important tool, and I think it has been an important tool at particular moments in time for getting word out in a way that can mobilize people. But it is not a substitute for the real organisation and networks that you need on the ground. That's the way I would look at it. So I think we should use it, but we should not imagine that because 50,000 people watch a video, that in and of itself is going to bring the change. If 50,000 people watch a video which says meet at Trafalgar Square and 50,000 turn up, then that's been a very useful exercise. So that's the way I would look at it. And also to win certain battles of ideas, as long as you are genuinely reaching out to people beyond yourself. And I think that's the other thing, isn't it, is that we have to win an argument. The arguments are different sometimes in different places. I think the argument in Ireland is slightly different from where it is here, because even the most conservative, really, in Ireland, with almost very few exceptions, would at least feel the need to articulate solidarity with Palestine. There's a problem in pushing them to action, and that's where the debate is in Ireland. So there's a general acceptance that the Palestinian people are being treated with cruel injustice, they are oppressed, that what's happening in Gaza is criminal, that the apartheid wall is an obscenity, and that the Palestinian people have suffered. But what can we do about it? And the Irish government sort of says we're limited because of the European Union and so on. But they speak, if you like, a little bit better than other leaders. So we've got a particular battle here. In Britain, I'd be keen to hear from you, but I certainly think the battle here is we have to absolutely nail this nonsense that speaking against the apartheid regime is anti-Semitism. And I think, frankly, the left, I'm sorry, in a way, I would have been interested to hear what Shtaya had to say, but I think Labour failed the test badly when they were attacked in this way, that they should have come out much more, in a much more forthright and confident way, and said it is precisely because I am against racism that I oppose the apartheid state of Israel. And I will not suffer for 1 second an accusation that I'm anti-Semitic for saying that, and confidently explain about the ethnic cleansing that the Palestinians have suffered, the apartheid regime that is imposed on them, and that apartheid has no place in the civilized world, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in South Africa, or anywhere else. And to be confident in saying that. And we need people here who are confident to go out and do that, and not to be intimidated by those who are out to intimidate and cower those who support the Palestinian cause. So to me, and we've got to be imaginative about how we win that argument, but we've got to go out and be absolutely clear that is the argument that has to be won. And I think then you can deploy all sorts of means, whether it's artistic, cultural, social media, political meetings, demonstrations, organising in colleges, organising in unions. You know, there's many different aspects, but we need to be absolutely clear that we're going to nail that argument.
So there is two points related to social media thing. The first one is the social media puppet, which is basically, we call it the echo chamber, where social media is isolating people, or they are making like a gathering for like-minded people to know each other and to share their content. But let's be honest, that matters. We can't ignore that. We keep talking about that during the advocacy sessions in front of the social media companies. But when we are talking about digital oppression, then we should fight back. We can't leave the platforms for other people to fill the narrative, their narrative, the propaganda, the Israeli propaganda, which is usually either accusing activists as anti-Semitic, or they are sharing stereotyping about Palestinian people. Then we should be there. Over the past couple of years, even with the previous attacks on Gaza Strip, the narrative was not amplified like this year. And that's a positive change. And because of that, I was like thinking we should build on that. We should continue and keep the momentum, because this year there was a Palestinian voices. They were amplified in the international media stream. We have never ever seen the first page of the New York Times talking about Gaza children who were killed in the attack, sorry. But this is the first year we have seen that. This is the first year where Los Angeles Times, Reuters, and other international mainstream media were talking about the digital oppression against Palestinians. And that matters, because on the long term, this is a change in the social media companies' policies. And because of that, I believe we should keep resisting on social media platforms. We can't create this kind of gap. It's already created. It's already, if we just look at the Palestinian content, there is a gap, because not everything is felt there. Who's our audience? There is a mislead for the Palestinian mobilizing and organizing on the social media, and luckily nowadays the young generation, are much more aware of that, and we are trying to mobilize and organize ourselves, and I hope we can build on that and continue working on that. There is something very important when talking about that, is what kind of audience of content, but also who's our audience, because sometimes people thinking of writing on social media just for writing or just for sharing, and they, for example, they keep copying and pasting specific hashtags, which really do not do anything, or it has no effect. People should understand how to utilize digital tools, including social media, in order to mobilize other people. And because of that, like civil society organizations, including our organization, Hamlet, our Center for the Advancement of Social Media, we were sharing some tips for people. Don't share only hashtag, just write a story. Try to use other languages, because we don't want to mobilize Palestinians. We want to mobilize other people, other allies, or sometimes like people on the social media, when we are looking at them from a Palestinian perspective, we see pro-Palestinian, anti-Palestinian, and there is some neutral people who don't have any kind of position from the Palestinian cause. And our mission as a young Palestinian is to try to attract them and to convince them with our ideas, with our discussions, and try to build on that. I hope that's convincing for you, but I believe on that.
Convinced and just trying to
Despite the
convince
fact
everyone
that, despite the fact that I don't believe only on digital activism. I believe there should be a harmony between the digital activism and the offline activism. I should stress on that because people usually misunderstood the digital activism and they think digital activism is just sitting in front of your laptop and just write posts without having any kind of organizing or mobilizing on the ground. I hope that's convincing.
So I understand that the question in itself, I believe, was someone playing devil's advocate, and I think that's useful. I think there's actually a great deal that we can do as Palestinians or as Palestinian activists in Europe, in the West, and in Britain in particular. Some of these points might echo the points that were brought up, but amongst them is consolidating that base. At the heart of every movement and organization is the base that's with you, and then those you're trying to reach out to. It requires a dual-pronged strategy of consolidating that base and then reaching out to those who are in the grey area. This also requires that organizationally we have to consider unification upon principle and upon common objectives. So the squabbling or the disagreements that come between smaller organizations needs to halt. And the youth have to be at the forefront of this, prioritizing particular realistic objectives that stem from those core ideals and values that we have agreed and united upon. There are other things that we can do that might be better known to us. Lobbying, writing letters to MPs, putting pressure, whether political, legal, social. All of these put pressure, all of them do harm. If they didn't do harm, there wouldn't be such a Zionist obsession about them. So every time you hear about complaints, about protests, about hashtags, you hear about silencing on social media, understand that it hurts. If it didn't hurt, they wouldn't care. And it's about also understanding that yes, international solidarity is very important. Boycotting is very important. International solidarity played an important role in that solidarity with South Africa, I believe, in that, with trying to bring down apartheid South Africa. But at the same time, we have to understand our place. The change fundamentally will come from within. Now we have to be that support from the outside. We have to be there to stand by them. But fundamentally, there's only so much that we can do. It is the Palestinians that will make that final change, that will deal that final blow to Zionist apartheid regime. But we have to say to them that we're here for you, and in your times of weakness, or in times where others cannot speak out, we will speak out for you. It's also a matter of passing on the ideas to the future generations. I mean, I was just mentioning to Richard before that, for instance, I grew up with my father used to, him and I used to listen to Irish revolutionary songs. So, for instance, A Nation Once Again was a favourite between me and my father, and it still is. And it's one that I love. And it was that I grew up with that, A Nation Once Again. And the Irish did achieve it. And it might sound odd what I'm about to say because of the mix of cultures, but accept it. Inshallah, I hope that Ireland, all of it, becomes a nation once again, a united nation. But because I grew up with that, I think that must have had a role, I imagine that had a role in me today doing what I do. And believing that, yes, Palestine must be a nation once again. And I think that we should not retreat, even if we feel that we're only reaching a certain particular crowd or consolidating that base. And also even within the pro-Palestinian crowd, and I'll conclude with this, that actually within the Palestinian crowd, there's convincing to be done. Convincing within the Palestinian crowd that, for instance, a two-state solution won't cut it. It just won't do. Let's throw that idea away. That was a terrible idea. I don't know who came up with that at some point in time. But let's just make sure that that hasn't just gone into the garbage can, that's gone into, being just, that's just completely far away from us as possible. So convincing people that, for instance, it's not a conflict. Convincing people that a two-state solution is just not on the table. Convincing people that the corrupt leadership do not represent the Palestinian people or the Palestinian cause. These are all battles that we have to face even within the pro-Palestinian sector. But yes, I think it's not a matter of despairing. I think there's much that we can do in our own respective ways, whether artists, poets, political activists, scholars, academics, we all have our role to play, inshallah. Thank you.
Some absolutely very valid remarks. Any other questions? Yeah. I think that will be the last question that we will take.
Well, it's not a question, it's an observation. This t-shirt I've got on, I've had for absolutely years. My poll tax t-shirt is hanging on the wall as a piece of memorabilia, as is my my minus stripe memorabilia is now worth money. This t-shirt should be a piece of history. It should not be being worn still. It should be on the wall with all my memorabilia of stuff that I've been feeling passionate about.
Right. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Okay, in that case then I'll just have a question. So the Nakba reminds us that international law is predicated on the aggression and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, since it was international law that recognized Israel's right to exist. We know that it was through the birth of the UN, and the UN legitimized 55% of that land and called it Israel, like blatantly, like it could be any clearer, despite the fact that those settlers, despite being settlers, were only 35% of the population. How can we reconcile the idea that international law recognizes Israel? And it's interesting, in 1948, there is a recognition for those borders. There's a recognition that even the Nakba itself isn't recognized. Like, let's be honest, right? There's a recognition that 80% of historic Palestine is quote-unquote Israeli, but in 1967, when the Nakba happened and you had the occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights, that was rejected. Those territories were considered illegal. That remaining 20% is illegal. So sometimes I feel like when we're protesting and we're advocating for Palestine, but our yardstick becomes international law, okay, well then I'll tell you that international law recognizes 80% of historic Palestine belongs to Israel. So how can you reconcile that idea of international law with actually the liberation of all of Palestine? I shall ask this question to all of you, beginning with Richard again. That's okay.
All the difficult questions. Well, I always say, even under international law, Palestinians are being denied their rights. In other words, I would always be slightly qualifying in my belief in international law as a key yardstick for what's right and what's just. So I would try and win the argument on the basis of justice and truth, and not just international law. So I always use that word even under international law. And I think that's important for the reasons that are being alluded to in the question, is absolutely the United Nations is culpable in the partition of Palestine. And that partition was a disaster. And I think, and it kind of relates to that, you know, one of the arguments we have to win is actually about how partition has always been a disaster. It was a disaster in Ireland, and that disaster, by the way, isn't over. You know, I mean, things have significantly improved because it was challenged largely successfully in the South, although the ramifications of partition still reverberated in the Free State. And of course in the North, they continue to reverberate with an institutionalized sectarian system that's not dissimilar to Lebanon. We were talking about Lebanon, where sectarianism institutionalized. Now, the sort of overt sectarianism and racism that was characteristic of the Orange state, of the Northern state, is now not legitimate anymore, but it still persists, and I think most people know that. So I think Ireland is, in a way, is a good example to point to and say, look, what a disaster partition was in Ireland. And I think most people, even some who are maybe aren't quite sure what they think about Palestine and Israel, are a bit confused. And I think what Mona said about trying to reach that middle group, you know, who can recognise there's a problem and recognise that Palestinians are suffering and that some of the things Israel do, they can see are overtly horrendous, but then somehow get pulled by the idea that, oh yes, but I can't question Israel because that would be anti-Semitism. I think we need to remind them that at the heart of that is a partition along ethnic and racist lines, and that that is a bad thing in itself, and the UN was guilty of it. So yeah, I don't think we are required in referencing the right to return of saying that the UN developed international law is the last word on justice. It's not. And indeed the UN have made some other pretty horrendous mistakes, most notably the Gulf War of 1991 to name another one. And you know, you could go on through the list. And I think we should obviously remind people that the UN remains dominated by the major imperial powers and that there are fundamental problems with the way the United Nations is organised. That's not to say that the principle of having an international law and having a sort of, you know, international solidarity in the pursuit of justice is a good idea, but the United Nations has a long way to go in actually achieving that. So, hope that answers the
So
question.
it's like holding them to account at that time.
I think so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. But also, yes, exactly, recognising that they have fallen short very considerably.
Sam? Again, start.
Yeah, I'd say it's not an easy question. It's one that requires that we understand the history, perhaps, of international law, the history of the UN, as we alluded to, the idea that these are institutions, although they are well-meaning, and perhaps more well-meaning than others, that were established by colonial powers. And this is why when you hear before the UN things about self-determination, it applies to some, not for all. Because it applies to the some that they had in their mind when they were drafting it up, but not to the all that would serve to harm particular interests of colonial powers. I think we are with international law so long as it corroborates and stands by our principles and our values. Those values of decolonization, egalitarianism, and liberty. When we find that they come into direct conflict with that, we then obviously stand by our principles, and I think what you mentioned there, and things even such as the veto, particular functions of the UN are completely unacceptable to the peoples of the world because it serves as a vehicle of oppression, and we see that very frequently, and many countless thousands of lives probably are victims of these institutions, and that embody that spirit of colonialism and racism to varying degrees, because it's inevitable that particular institutions or laws instituted by peoples with particular agendas are going to reflect those agendas, even if it is not overt in the word and the text of the law itself. As well as this, and you have particular contradictions. There was a UN resolution, for instance, that recognized Zionism as a form of racism, right? Until Arafat took PLO's capitulation, right? Which is another, damnation of them as traitors. But I mean, regardless of that, that comes with contradiction, because if the UN then accepts that Zionism is racism and Israel is the manifestation of Zionism, that means Israel is a racist state. Right? So then what do? Do you then say it's legitimate, racism is legitimate, and not only is racism legitimate, the state manifestation of racism is legitimate, because the UN also previously agreed upon that? Then you have to pick between principle or the law that is enacted by some of the most bloodthirsty powers that existed and still, unfortunately, preside over much of the world. And I think that's a decision that we can very clearly decide on. We stand by our principles and by our values. But we have to be consistent upon those and ensure that people are consistent upon those values and those principles and don't just go by what they accept as law. Because this comes to another question, which is the issue of when is it just to resist the law? And when it comes to matters of oppression, when it comes to matters of subjugation, when it comes to matters of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of racism. Civil disobedience is not a choice. Civil disobedience is a duty.
Thank you very much. I think you can summarize it in one sentence. It's an oxymoron. But yeah, please.
So, in one sentence, I believe they covered the issue, but I feel that our issue in Palestine should be thinking about living in equality, justice, and freedom. Maybe this should be a start. Like the international law, despite the fact there is this kind of split or counting after 1948 or whatsoever, at least we as human rights defenders, we can build allies and build on progressive movements to think about freedom, justice, and equality in Palestine. And then we can reclaim or rethink what kind of, or what is, to be honest, that's too complicated for now. Because we even don't have, like our leadership is keep talking about two-state solution. We are living in a reality of one-state solution, but the international law is talking about something also different. So there is some kind of complexity. So because of that, I believe we should start from the reality that we are living in. Even starting with the international law is not a bad idea. And then till we reach that point, maybe we can think what's next.
Yeah, it's interesting. But see, the cut-off point is like if you recognize your occupier, then that's kind of like the red line there. Because if you're giving legitimacy to the one that is occupying you versus saying we want coexistence, when they don't want coexistence, when clearly they're occupying, that I think becomes the kind of cut-off point. That makes many people confused, you know.
Could I just briefly,
Yeah, sure.
just briefly comment? I mean, this
Yeah.
it's a very good question, it really is,
Yeah.
and I certainly don't have all the answers. We need to dwell on it a little bit, but I do think you can point to the contradiction. Because you see, insofar as most people adhere to the idea of international law or subscribe to the notion that the United Nations is a good idea, then they expect consistency around key principles like vindicating human rights, opposing racism, opposing apartheid. And I think if you can establish those principles, then you could say, well, in fact, the partition in 1947-48, their acceptance of that, actually they fell far short of the principles they themselves promote. Now that's, I mean, I say that as somebody who, that's, in truth, I am deeply critical of the United Nations. Okay, I think there's a major problem with the United Nations, and I'm not sure if it can ever be reformed, quite honestly, given its domination by the major imperial powers. But having said that, I think we can relate to the sentiment of people out there who believe there's such thing as a human right to self-determination, not to be the subject of oppression, not to be the subject of racism, to vindicate the idea of equality before the law. Do you know? And I think that's why people invest certain belief in the United Nations, even if in reality the United Nations is not that thing. It is often under pressure to say it is for that thing and to establish certain principles around that. I mean, some of the very good definitions of apartheid have actually come from the United Nations. And I think you can absolutely hang the apartheid state of Israel on the United Nations definition of apartheid because it ticks every single box. So, and I think if you can establish that, then you could go back quite easily and say what the United Nations did in 1947-48 in recognizing this ethnic, racist partition of the land of Palestine was a pretty criminal mistake by the United Nations. So I think it's possible to begin with those principles and then bring it back to, you know, the crime of the Nakba and partition and, you know, legitimizing the Zionist project.
And 1948 happened because it represented their interests, whereas 1967 the superpowers have no interest in Israel expanding beyond the 80% border, right? So it's like, then it becomes illegal. So it's illegal when it's not suiting their interests, but it's legal when it, so it's almost like the yardstick of the UN is the interest aspect for the superpowers, because it represents a compromise on their interests. Yeah. So, thank you very, very much for our dear panelists. You were amazing, very insightful. Many very important points that were raised that I think a lot of us will reflect on, aspects of unity, aspects of solidarity, mobilization, centering it all back to the root cause of the issue. Thank you so much to our dear guests for attending, despite the rules, the changes that we're seeing around us, and making that effort. We really do appreciate it at the Return Centre. And not to forget that tomorrow is actually the final event within this whole week's campaigning. The session will be, I believe, with Salem Nusseibeh and Mika Khaled. I forgot who the third speaker was. That's Terry as well, yeah. So it's a very strong panel, so please do tune in with the Return Centre. It should be on YouTube, it should be on Facebook as well. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, round of applause.
Sorry,